The sound of glass shattering didn't come from anger. It came from disbelief. Amani Rhodes stood barefoot on the cool stone floor of the high-rise condo, staring at the laptop on the kitchen island as champagne soaked into the rug she'd picked out herself. The receipt was still glowing on the screen, bright, undeniable, impossible to misunderstand. 2 plane tickets, a luxury hotel in Montreal, a weekend marked strategy offsite, and a name she had never seen before. For a long moment, the city of Toronto hummed below her. Traffic, sirens, life continuing as if nothing monumental had just cracked open inside her chest. Her hand hovered over the trackpad, then scrolled. 1 receipt became 2. 2 became a thread became a pattern. And then she saw it. An email forwarded to investors. Her language, her framework, her data model, word for word. Signed at the bottom, Ethan Caldwell, founder and CEO. Amani felt the air thin, like the room had quietly decided she no longer needed oxygen. She had spent 3 years building the architecture of his company, nights hunched over datasets, weekends lost to whiteboards and simulations, ideas shaped with the precision of a surgeon. She had told herself they were partners, that love meant trust, that silence was collaboration. Now the silence roared. The front door clicked, a familiar sound, his footsteps in the hall. Amani closed the laptop just as Ethan's voice floated in, warm and careless. "Hey babe, you still up?" She didn't answer. She couldn't, not yet. Her heart was racing, but her face went still. Not blank, not cold, focused. Somewhere deep inside, something instinctive had taken control, the way it does right before impact. This wasn't just infidelity, this was erasure. And if this moment already has you holding your breath, take a second, quietly, before the storm breaks, to like this story, leave a comment, and follow the channel. Not because you're supposed to, but because you'll want to remember where you were when it began. Ethan walked into the kitchen, loosening his tie, confidence radiating from him like it always did. The kind of confidence that came from being praised in rooms Amani rarely entered, from being called visionary for ideas that had been born at her fingertips. "You look tired," he said gently. "I thought you'd be asleep." Amani met his eyes. The same eyes she had once trusted without reservation. The same eyes that now felt like mirrors, reflecting a man she was only just beginning to see clearly. "Couldn't sleep," she replied. He smiled, poured himself a glass of water, and leaned casually against the counter, standing inches away from the laptop that held the evidence of everything he had stolen. "Big week coming up. North Lake pitch. This one could change everything for us." "For us." The words landed differently now. Amani nodded, slow and deliberate. Inside her mind, files were rearranging themselves, memories resurfacing with new meaning, conversations she had brushed past, moments she had softened for the sake of love. She realized then that the receipt wasn't the betrayal. It was the confirmation. The betrayal had been happening for years, quietly, methodically, wrapped in affection and praise. He hadn't taken her work by force. He had taken it because she trusted him not to. Ethan kissed her forehead and headed toward the bedroom, already texting someone back, unaware that the ground beneath him had just shifted. Amani waited until the door closed. Then she reopened the laptop. This time, she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't ask why. She started a folder. She named it Proof. And in that moment, standing alone in a city that had no idea what was coming, Amani Rhodes stopped being a woman who believed in the dream they built together. She became the woman who would decide how it ended. Before the receipts, before the stolen decks and the quiet humiliations dressed up as strategy, there was a night in Chicago when Amani Rhodes believed she'd met someone who could finally see her, fully, clearly, without needing her to shrink first. It was late autumn, the kind of cold that made the city feel sharpened around the edges. Amani had just left a graduate symposium at Northwestern, her head still full of models and methods, the thrill of hard-won clarity humming under her skin. She was 26, brilliant in a way that didn't announce itself, and exhausted from rooms where her brilliance had to fight for oxygen. The reception was crowded with polished laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft cruelty of academic networking. She wore a black blazer that made her feel like armor, even though it couldn't protect her from the way people looked past her toward louder men with easier confidence. That was when Ethan Caldwell stepped into her orbit. He wasn't the most important person in the room. He wasn't the loudest. He wasn't even the most handsome, though he was undeniably attractive in that clean-cut American way that made doors open before he touched them. What made him dangerous was something subtler. He listened. Amani had made a comment about consumer behavior being less about desire and more about identity management, about how people bought narratives the way they bought products. A man across from her had smiled politely, the way men do when they want credit for understanding without the burden of actually doing it. Ethan didn't smile politely. He leaned in as if he didn't want to miss a word. "Say that again," he said. "Not because I didn't hear you, because I want to remember it exactly." It felt startling to be asked for her thoughts like they mattered, like they were rare. "You're building a predictive framework," he continued, almost reverent. "Not a thesis, a weapon." Amani laughed once, half surprised, half wary. "That's a dramatic way to describe statistics." "It's a respectful way," he corrected, and something in his tone softened. "Most people here are just performing intelligence. You're actually doing it." No one had spoken to her like that in those rooms. Not without implication, not without trying to take. Ethan's attention didn't feel like a transaction. It felt like recognition. That's what she mistook it for anyway. They talked for an hour by a window rimmed with frost, Chicago glittering behind them like a promise. He told her he dropped out of an MBA program because he couldn't stand the idea of spending years learning how to sell other people's ideas when he wanted to build something real. He said he was starting a company, an analytics-driven branding platform, and he needed someone who understood how human behavior worked beneath the numbers. He didn't say, "I need you," exactly. He said, "I've been looking for a mind like yours." Amani should have heard the risk in that phrase. She didn't. Because when you've spent your whole life being underestimated, being told, directly or indirectly, that you're impressive for someone like you, the first person who speaks to you as if your intellect is inevitable feels like rescue. And Ethan made it feel clean. He didn't flatter her beauty in those early days. He didn't love bomb her with promises. He didn't push. He was steady, consistent, patient, almost careful. He emailed her articles that connected to her research. He sent voice notes at midnight with sudden ideas, not demanding answers, just sharing the excitement, like a child showing you a constellation they discovered. When she challenged him, he didn't bristle. He grinned. "I like that you don't let people get away with lazy thinking," he said once. "It's rare." The first time he asked her to meet again, it wasn't a date in the traditional sense. It was coffee in a quiet place where no one would interrupt, because he wanted to hear her expand on a concept she'd mentioned in passing. When she arrived, he'd already printed her most recent paper and highlighted sections with questions in the margins. Real questions, not performative ones. Amani remembered staring at the pages and thinking, "No one has ever taken my work this seriously. Not as an accessory, not as a box to check, not as a token." For the first time in years, she stopped bracing. And that was the doorway he walked through. Because Ethan wasn't lying when he said he admired her mind. That was the cruelest part. He did admire it. He admired it the way some people admire sunlight. Warmth they want near them, brightness they want to stand in, power they want to borrow. In the months that followed, he became the soft place she landed when the world demanded she be iron. When a professor dismissed her questions, Ethan got furious on her behalf. When a recruiter spoke over her during an interview, Ethan remembered every detail and repeated her point louder, as if amplifying her was an act of love. "You shouldn't have to fight this hard just to be heard," he said one night, pacing her apartment while she sat curled on the couch. If you build with me, I can take the heat. I can handle the politics. You can focus on the work. It sounded like devotion. It sounded like partnership. It sounded like protection. And Amani, who had spent her entire life learning how to survive inside systems that were not built for her, heard relief. She heard safety. She heard someone offering to carry what she'd always carried alone. She didn't realize then that "I'll handle the politics" could become "I'll control the narrative." She didn't realize that "you focus on the work" could become "you stay in the shadows." She didn't realize that the man who made space for her voice in private would one day make sure her voice disappeared in public. But in the beginning, it really did feel like love. When Ethan proposed, it was in a small restaurant with dim light and jazz in the background. Nothing flashy. His hands shook a little as he took out the ring. "I don't want to build a company without you," he said, voice thick. "And I don't want to build a life without you either." Amani cried then, not because the moment was perfect, but because it felt like vindication. Like the universe had finally given her a witness, a partner, a man who didn't fear her intelligence, who didn't need to compete with it. She said yes because she believed him, and because she wanted to. That's what made the betrayal so lethal. Not that he took her work, but that he took the one thing she had rarely been given and had finally allowed herself to trust. The feeling of being seen. The first time Amani noticed something was wrong, it was so small she almost missed it. It happened in a glass-walled conference room in downtown Chicago, on a Tuesday afternoon that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and ambition. The company was still young then, fragile, electric, full of promise. Whiteboards crowded with equations, laptops open like shields. Amani sat at the far end of the table, knees crossed, notebook balanced neatly in front of her. She had been up until 3 in the morning, building the model they were about to present. Not just numbers. Amani never did just numbers. This was a behavioral architecture, a framework that mapped how consumers move through identity, aspiration, and trust. It was elegant, predictive, powerful. She knew it was good in that quiet way brilliant people know, without needing applause. Ethan stood at the head of the table, relaxed, confident, remote in a tailored jacket that signaled seriousness to people who mistook polish for substance. He clicked to the first slide. Amani's breath caught. The framework was there. Her framework. The same structure, the same logic, the same language, barely adjusted. Even the metaphors were hers, phrases she recognized because she'd wrestled with them, discarded weaker versions, sharpened them late at night when the city outside their apartment slept. But her name wasn't on the slide. She told herself it was an oversight. People laughed softly at Ethan's opening joke. Investors leaned forward. The room warmed to him quickly, the way rooms always did. He spoke with conviction, with clarity, with the authority of a man who had never been questioned before he opened his mouth. "As you can see," he said, gesturing to the screen, "we're not just selling products, we're modeling belief." Amani felt a flicker of something, not anger yet, not fear, confusion. She waited. Surely, she thought, he would say it next. Surely he would turn and say, "This comes from Amani's work," or "My wife developed this model," or even, "Our team discovered," but he didn't. He moved seamlessly to the next slide, then the next. Each one built on her ideas. Each one landed perfectly. Each one earned nods, murmurs of approval, a scribble of notes from people whose approval translated directly into power. Amani's name never came. Her fingers tightened around her pen. At one point, an investor interrupted. "This is sharp. Where did this insight come from?" Ethan smiled easily. "We've been developing it internally for months." The word was so smooth, it almost erased the problem entirely. Almost. After the meeting, people clustered around Ethan, congratulating him, shaking his hand. Someone clapped him on the shoulder and said, "You've got a real mind for this." Amani stood, invisible but not forgotten, at least not by herself. In the hallway outside the conference room, she caught up to him. "Hey," she said lightly, keeping her voice neutral. That deck. Ethan turned, still glowing from validation. Killed it, right? It did, she said. Then carefully, my name wasn't on it. For half a second, just half, a flicker crossed his face. Too fast for anyone else to notice. Too slow for Amani to ignore. Oh, he said, laughing softly. That. Yeah, I thought about it. Thought about it. He slipped an arm around her waist, lowering his voice as people passed by. Listen, it's not that I don't want to credit you. Of course I do. But early-stage investors like a clear narrative. One vision. One voice. Amani frowned. But it was my work. I know, he said quickly, squeezing her side. And everyone here knows you're brilliant. But the politics of it matter. We can't confuse them. Not yet. Not yet. He kissed her temple, affectionate, disarming. You trust me, right? This is just for now. Once we're established, we'll do it differently. Amani hesitated. Every instinct she had sharpened over years, every warning she'd learned the hard way, stirred awake. She knew what it meant to be asked to wait, to be patient, to be told that credit would come later, once things were safer, smoother, less inconvenient. She also knew what it meant to be seen as difficult, as emotional, as divisive. And she loved him, so she nodded. Okay, she said, for now. Ethan smiled, relieved. That's my girl. The words landed strangely. Not cruel, not malicious, just possessive enough to register. That night, back in their apartment, Amani opened her laptop to refine the model further. Ethan sat beside her, scrolling through emails, occasionally glancing over to ask a question or suggest a phrasing. They worked like that for hours, bodies close, minds overlapping, the quiet intimacy of shared creation. But something had shifted. Amani noticed how he began to phrase things when friends asked about the company. I'm building this new framework, he'd say, or I've been thinking a lot about consumer identity. She noticed how introductions changed. She became my wife, who helps with the creative side. Helps. The word was small, harmless, easy to ignore, and she did ignore it because challenging it felt like threatening everything they were building, because she told herself love required compromise, because she believed that if she just kept producing, just kept being excellent, the truth would eventually assert itself. Excellence, she believed, could not be erased. She didn't yet understand that erasure doesn't begin with theft. It begins with permission. Years later, standing in the Toronto condo with receipts glowing on a screen and silence screaming in her ears, Amani would think back to that conference room in Chicago, to the moment she noticed her name was missing, to the moment she chose love over visibility, and she would finally see it for what it was. Not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, but the first clean cut in a long, careful process of making her disappear while convincing her she was being protected. That was the first erasure, and it was the one that made all the others possible. The city never truly slept. Not Toronto, not with its glass towers lit like watchful eyes and its streets humming long after midnight. But inside the condo, time felt suspended, as if the universe had leaned in close to see what Amani Rhodes would do next. Ethan's shower turned on. The familiar rush of water, the careless certainty of a man who believed the world would keep arranging itself around him. Amani waited until the bathroom door clicked shut. Then she moved. Not fast, not frantic, precise. She slid the laptop back open, and the glow painted her face in a pale, unforgiving light. Her fingers didn't tremble anymore. What trembled was something deeper, an old belief cracking and collapsing in slow motion. Love, safety, partnership, the soft mythology she'd lived inside. She pushed it aside like a curtain, because tonight wasn't for grief. Tonight was for inventory. She opened the email thread again, and this time she didn't read it like a wife. She read it like an analyst, line by line, pattern by pattern, seeing the structure beneath the betrayal. Forwarded messages to investors. Summaries in his voice that carried her cadence underneath, like a ghost. Attachments renamed, cleaned, stripped of authorship. Her work, repackaged into his vision. Amani's throat tightened. She swallowed it down, not to suppress emotion, but to keep her hands steady. First, evidence preservation. She plugged in an external drive she hadn't used in months. Its small click sounded louder than it should have, like a lock turning. She created folders with clean names, the way she always did when she built systems. Decks, models, timelines, finance, communications. She had learned long ago that when people want to erase you, they rely on one thing: your inability to prove you existed in the first place. She would not give him that. Amani logged into their shared cloud storage. The password was still the same, an anniversary date Ethan loved because it made him feel sentimental. She almost laughed at the cruelty of it, but her chest wouldn't allow it. Her mind, however, kept moving. She opened version histories. There it was, the truth in timestamp. Draft after draft created under her account. Iterations saved at 2:13 a.m., 3:47 a.m., 5:02 a.m., the hours she had quietly bled herself into brilliance while he slept beside her, warm and unburdened. Her code commits, her documents, her original phrasing, and then the pattern of theft. A few hours later, Ethan would open the file. Copy, rename, export, present. Amani pressed her palm to her mouth as if to hold herself together from the outside. A tear formed anyway, hot and involuntary, and she wiped it away with annoyance. Not because tears were weakness, but because she couldn't afford to blur her vision. She kept going. She pulled Slack archives and conversation threads, messages where she explained ideas and he replied with praise. Genius, babe, this is why we'll win. Followed by meetings where her name never appeared. She exported the pitch decks for the biggest clients and compared them against her earliest drafts. The overlap was not influence. It was identity-level duplication. Her mind photocopied. Her stomach rolled. Then she opened their shared calendar. The trips were labeled with corporate language: off-site, client visit, conference prep. She cross-checked the details against the credit card statements. The statement wasn't a simple record of spending. It was a map of lies. Hotel, Montreal, 5-star. Dinner, a Michelin-starred place Amani had once said was too expensive to justify. A private driver, 2 tickets, 2 names. And then, there it was again, that unfamiliar name, Sienna Vale. Amani clicked through more charges, spa packages, champagne, a boutique purchase that made her eyes sting, not because of the money, but because she recognized the brand. Ethan had once told Amani they should be practical and save for the company, that luxury was something they could enjoy later. Later was apparently already happening, just not with her. She dug deeper, following the thread the way she followed anomalies in data sets. When something didn't belong, she traced it until the whole structure revealed itself. Amani opened Ethan's sent mail folder. Her hands paused above the keyboard. A different kind of fear rose then. Not fear of what she would find, she already knew. Fear of what it would mean to see it in his words. But she didn't look away. There were emails to Sienna that didn't just betray a marriage, they betrayed a worldview. He mocked her, not directly at first, just in small, surgical jokes. The way men mock women they feel entitled to. Soft enough to deny, sharp enough to wound. She's brilliant, but she doesn't understand how the world works. She wants credit. It's cute. Don't worry, she'll never leave. She's invested. Invested. Like she was an asset. Amani's breath came short. And for the first time that night, she had to stand up, walk to the window, and put her forehead against the cold glass. Below, traffic moved like veins carrying life through the city. People were laughing somewhere, living, unaware. Amani closed her eyes and tried to find the version of Ethan she loved. The one who had asked her to repeat her ideas because he wanted to remember them. The one who had held her when she came home exhausted from being the only black woman in the room. The one who had said, "Build with me." Now she understood the truth that made the memory sour in her mouth. He hadn't wanted to build with her. He had wanted to build on her. The shower turned off. Amani snapped back into motion. She returned to the laptop, heart hammering, and accelerated. Screenshots, exports, backups, time-stamped logs. She documented everything with the cold thoroughness of someone preparing for court. Because somewhere inside her, a quieter voice had begun to speak with terrifying clarity. If he had spent years editing her out, then she would gather enough proof to write herself back in. She opened a blank document and began a timeline. Not emotional, factual. Date of first major pitch, her drafts, his presentation, client award announcement, his public credit, her private work. Each line was a nail. By the time she finished, the sky outside had begun to change. Black thinning into bruised blue, the first hint of dawn leaking into the edges of the world. Amani stared at her folder, at the neat architecture of truth she had built in the dark. Decks, models, finance, communications, a whole life of stolen labor, organized like evidence. In the bedroom, Ethan moved around, humming softly, as if today would be just another day he took what didn't belong to him. Amani's eyes were dry now, not because she wasn't hurt, because something in her had hardened into purpose. She closed the laptop, and in the quiet that followed, she realized the strangest thing of all. She wasn't powerless. She had never been powerless. Tonight, she took inventory, and what she counted, what she finally saw, laid out in files and timestamps and receipts, was not just betrayal. It was leverage. There was no thunder, no dramatic sunrise announcing transformation, just pale light slipping through the sheer curtains, touching the edges of a room that suddenly felt unfamiliar, like a place she'd lived in for years without ever owning. Amani stood in the bathroom, staring at her reflection. She looked the same. Same dark curls pulled into a loose knot, same faint crease between her brows from years of concentration. Same woman who had built systems powerful enough to move markets. And yet, something in her eyes had shifted. They were quieter now, not softer, clearer, like a lake after a storm settles, revealing everything beneath the surface. She placed both hands on the marble counter and leaned forward, studying herself the way she studied problems that refused to yield easy answers. Because this was one. Maybe the hardest one she'd ever faced. What do I do now? The evidence sat heavy in her mind, meticulously ordered, impossible to dismiss. She could end him. Not emotionally, that part had already happened, but professionally, publicly, permanently. The plan was already forming in her head with frightening ease, steps aligning, outcomes projecting forward like a simulation she knew how to run better than anyone. And that terrified her. Because power, once acknowledged, asked a question that couldn't be avoided. What kind of person are you when you finally have it? Amani straightened and met her own gaze. She remembered her mother standing at a different mirror years ago, adjusting a scarf before leaving for work, saying something that hadn't made sense at the time. People think strength is how hard you hit back, her mother had said. It's not. It's knowing when you're protecting yourself, and when you're becoming someone you won't recognize later. Amani had nodded then, young and impatient, not yet aware of how often the world would test that distinction. Now the test was here. If she exposed Ethan, she would be right. The facts were on her side. The truth was undeniable. But truth didn't exist in a vacuum. It existed in systems, legal, social, cultural, that didn't always reward women who disrupted them. Especially not Black women who refused to be gracious about betrayal. She imagined the headlines, the whispers, the familiar tilt of skepticism. Was she really the brain behind it? Why didn't she speak up sooner? Is this just a messy divorce? The questions burned because she knew how easily they could stick. For the first time since the night before, doubt crept in. Not doubt about what Ethan had done, but doubt about whether she had the right to do what she was about to do. She closed her eyes. Images surfaced uninvited. Herself, smaller, laughing too softly in rooms where she should have spoken louder. Herself nodding when her name disappeared from slides. Herself swallowing irritation because love felt more important than recognition. She saw the cost of restraint written across years of her life. And then she saw something else, a future version of herself, still brilliant, still capable, but quieter, safer, reduced to footnotes in stories she had authored. That future scared her more than any backlash ever could. Amani exhaled slowly and opened her eyes. No, she said aloud, testing the word in the empty room. This wasn't revenge. Revenge was emotional, reckless, designed to soothe a wound by creating another. What she was contemplating was something colder, more disciplined. Correction. She wasn't trying to hurt him. She was trying to stop the harm. There was a difference, and it mattered. She straightened her shoulders and took a step closer to the mirror, lowering her voice as if speaking to someone else entirely. If you do nothing, she said quietly, you teach him that this works. Her reflection didn't flinch. And if you destroy him, another part of her asked, what do you teach yourself? Amani thought about the women who came after her, the analysts, the strategists, the young black girls watching who would never know her name, but would live in a world shaped by what women like her tolerated or refused. She reached for a pen and a notepad, her mind finally settling into the calm that came when emotion made room for intention. She drew a line down the center of the page. On the left, she wrote, justice. On the right, cruelty. Under justice, she listed facts, boundaries, consequences, ownership. Under cruelty, she listed impulses, public shaming for its own sake, destruction without purpose. The list surprised her. What she wanted, to reclaim her work, her name, her agency, belonged firmly on the left. She wasn't trying to erase Ethan. He had done that work himself. Amani looked back at the mirror one last time. I'm not going to burn the house down, she said. I'm going to take my name off the deed. The decision settled into her bones with a strange gentleness. She would not scream. She would not beg. She would not rush. She would be precise. Behind her, the bedroom door opened, and Ethan's voice floated down the hall, light and untroubled. Morning, babe. Amani turned away from the mirror, her expression already composed, already unreadable. Yes, she replied calmly, stepping into the role she would play just a little while longer. Good morning. He had no idea that the woman he was looking at had just asked herself the most dangerous question of all, and answered it. Amani learned very quickly that peace, when performed well, was indistinguishable from surrender. She poured coffee the way she always did, 2 sugars, a dash of oat milk, listening to Ethan talk about the week ahead as if nothing had shifted beneath their feet. His voice carried that familiar blend of confidence and casual entitlement, the tone of a man who had never once questioned whether the world would keep rewarding him. The North Lake team loved the direction, he said, scrolling through his phone. We're exactly where we need to be. Amani nodded at the right moments, smiled when expected, asked 1 or 2 gentle questions that made her seem engaged, but not demanding. She could feel him relax in real time, like an animal reassured that the environment remained under control. This was the performance. The version of herself she presented now was careful, almost softer than before. She didn't challenge his phrasing, didn't flinch when he said, my framework, or my thinking. She even laughed, lightly, disarmingly, when he joked about how exhausted he was from carrying the company. Inside, something colder than anger settled into place. Because Amani understood something Ethan did not. Men like him mistook silence for consent, and calm for compliance. They had no language for patience that wasn't submission. That misunderstanding was about to cost him everything. Over the next few days, she perfected the role. She agreed more easily when he adjusted her work. She sent follow-up emails that sounded supportive rather than assertive. She stopped correcting him in conversations with others, even when he misrepresented her ideas so cleanly it felt surgical. Ethan noticed. You seem lighter, he said one evening, loosening his tie as they sat on the couch. Less tense. Amani smiled and rested her head against his shoulder. I guess I've just been thinking about perspective, she replied. Not every battle is worth fighting. The words were true, just not in the way he assumed. Her compliance became a kind of permission slip. Ethan began to overreach. He forwarded more drafts without checking with her first. He spoke more freely on calls, embellishing his role, minimizing hers with careless ease. He stopped being careful. That was the point. At night, while he slept, Amani documented everything. She sent herself recap emails after conversations, neutral in tone, meticulous in detail. As discussed today, the concept originated from my initial model dated. She archived meeting notes. She saved calendar invites. She let patterns form. During the day, she practiced a different kind of discipline, emotional restraint. There were moments when the mask almost slipped. Like the afternoon Ethan dismissed her suggestion in front of a junior associate, saying, "Amani tends to overthink the data." The associate laughed nervously. Amani felt the old heat rise, anger sharp and familiar. She swallowed it. Instead, she tilted her head and said mildly, "That's fair. Precision can feel like overthinking if you're not used to it." The associate blinked. Ethan chuckled, missing the quiet rebuke entirely. Later that night, alone in the bathroom, Amani stared at herself and exhaled slowly. The performance cost her something. Each act of restraint felt like a small betrayal of her own voice. But she reminded herself, this was not silence. This was strategy. Ethan grew increasingly comfortable, almost indulgent in his confidence. He spoke about future plans as if they were settled facts. An expansion, new hires, his name on panels and conference stages. "Our story plays well," he said one morning, distracted. "People love a visionary founder." Amani stirred her coffee and watched the liquid darken. "Stories are powerful," she said quietly. "They shape what people believe." He smiled at her, distracted, missing the weight of her words. Exactly. What he didn't see was how she had begun to change the narrative beneath his feet. She was no longer reacting. She was observing, watching how people responded to him, how they deferred, how they failed to ask questions because his confidence filled the space where scrutiny should have lived. She took notes, not on paper, but in memory. By the end of the week, Ethan had begun to believe the danger had passed, that whatever tension had flickered in her before was nothing more than stress, that she had, as always, chosen harmony over conflict. He didn't know that harmony was the most convincing disguise of all. One night, as they prepared for bed, he pulled her close and kissed her forehead, the same familiar gesture he'd used for years. "I'm glad we're good," he murmured. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Amani closed her eyes and let the words settle. "You're about to find out," she thought, but aloud, she said nothing. She lay awake long after he fell asleep, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. The city outside glowed faintly, indifferent and endless. Amani felt the strange calm that comes not from peace, but from certainty. Ethan believed the storm had passed. He didn't realize he was standing in its eye. And when it moved again, it wouldn't announce itself with raised voices or slammed doors. It would arrive dressed as professionalism, as facts, as consequences. And by then, the performance would be over. The trap didn't snap shut all at once, but closed politely, with a smile, with language so reasonable, it almost sounded kind. Amani first sensed it during a planning meeting for the North Lake pitch. The conference room was bright, walls lined with glass and ambition, the kind of space designed to make people feel important simply for occupying it. Ethan stood near the screen, remote in hand, outlining timelines and deliverables with practiced ease. "As usual," he said, glancing at Amani, "I'll handle the client-facing portion. Amani's been doing incredible work on the analytical side, so she'll support with insights as needed." Support. The word landed with a familiar dullness. Amani lifted her eyes from her notebook. "I was actually thinking it might be effective if I presented the identity model directly," she said calmly. "It's complex, and I can walk them through the assumptions more clearly." The room went quiet, not awkwardly, just enough for attention to sharpen. Ethan smiled, slow and indulgent, the way one smiles at a child who doesn't quite understand how things work yet. "That's generous," he said, But Northlake's executive team is traditional. They respond better to a single narrative voice. Consistency builds confidence. Amani held his gaze. They're a data-driven group, she replied. Accuracy builds confidence too. For a split second, irritation flashed across his face before smoothing back into charm. I hear you, he said, but let's not complicate the dynamic. You know how these rooms can be. There it was. Not, you're wrong. Not, this won't work. Just the implication. You don't belong in that space the way I do. Amani nodded slowly, as if conceding. Of course, she said. I trust your judgment. Ethan relaxed, already moving on. What he didn't notice was the subtle shift in the room. One of the junior analysts glanced at Amani, then away, absorbing the lesson without realizing it was being taught. This is how professional traps are built. Not with overt exclusion, but with repetition. With narratives that sound logical enough to defend and vague enough to deny. Over the next week, the pattern tightened. Meeting invites went out without her name. She was looped in for awareness instead of decision-making. When she joined calls, Ethan summarized her work before she could speak, framing it in ways that softened its edges and centered his authority. She's amazing with the details, he told a potential partner once, smiling. But I helped translate that into something executives can digest. Translate, as if her ideas were a foreign language, only he could interpret. Amani felt the familiar pressure rise, the urge to correct, to assert, to reclaim the narrative before it hardened. But she resisted. Because she recognized the strategy now. This wasn't insecurity, it was containment. Ethan wasn't afraid of her brilliance. He was afraid of what would happen if others recognized it without him standing in front of it. So he did what men like him had always done. He reframed the boundary as concern. One afternoon, he stopped by her desk, lowering his voice. I hope you're not feeling sidelined, he said gently. I just want to protect you from the politics. These spaces can be brutal. Amani looked up at him, her expression open. I appreciate that, she said, and she did, because the sentence itself was evidence. Protection had become the justification for exclusion. Care had become control. That night, she replayed the moment in her mind, not with anger, but with precision. She opened her laptop and typed a short, follow-up email. Per our conversation today, I understand that you'll be leading the Northlake presentation, while my role will remain internal, despite being the original architect of the identity model. Please confirm. She stared at the screen before sending it, aware of how thin the line was between documentation and provocation. Then she clicked send. Ethan replied an hour later. Yes, that makes sense for now. We'll revisit roles after the pitch. For now. Amani saved the email. The next escalation came disguised as praise. During a team check-in, Ethan announced, I've been telling everyone how indispensable Amani is. Honestly, without her, none of this works. The team murmured agreement. Amani smiled faintly, but the sentence was a cage. Indispensable meant essential, but invisible. Valuable, but replaceable in the narrative. A foundation no one bothers to name. After the meeting, a colleague pulled her aside. You're lucky, she said quietly. He really champions you. Amani almost laughed. Championing someone, she realized, didn't always mean lifting them up. Sometimes it meant standing in front of them, blocking the light while insisting you were the reason they were warm. The pressure built, not just professionally, but internally. Each concession scratched against her sense of self. Each swallowed correction felt like a rehearsal for disappearance. One evening, alone in the condo, she opened the folder labeled Proof and added a new subfolder. Positioning. She began cataloging the language Ethan used. The phrases, the framing, the way he spoke about her when she wasn't in the room, and when she was. She wasn't just building a case anymore. She was mapping a system. And with every note she took, one truth became clearer than anything else she'd uncovered so far. Ethan didn't need her silence to win. He needed her credibility, quietly absorbed, carefully rerouted, professionally laundered through his voice. That was the trap. And the moment she understood it, She also understood how to dismantle it, not by fighting him where he was strongest, but by letting him walk, confidently and publicly, into a story that could no longer hold its shape once the truth was introduced. The trap was set, just not for her. Amani had spent years believing that strength meant self-containment, that if she was sharp enough, disciplined enough, excellent enough, she could carry everything alone. It was a lesson she'd learned early, growing up in rooms where help came with strings and competence was the only currency no one could argue with. But as the trap around her tightened, she realized something quietly devastating. Isolation was not independence. It was vulnerability. The first person she called was Nia Park. Nia didn't work in a glass tower or sit on panels. She practiced intellectual property law out of a modest office near Queen Street, the kind of lawyer who didn't advertise because she didn't need to. Her reputation traveled by word of mouth, especially among people who'd been underestimated and burned. When Amani finished explaining, slowly, carefully, leaving nothing dramatic unsaid, there was silence on the line. Then Nia exhaled. "This isn't just theft," she said. "This is systematic appropriation. And the way he's done it, he thinks your proximity to him makes it unprovable." Amani closed her eyes. "That's exactly what it feels like." "Good," Nia replied, "because feelings don't matter here. Patterns do." They met 2 days later in a quiet cafe with scratched wooden tables and bad lighting. Amani slid her laptop across without ceremony. Nia didn't react outwardly as she scrolled. No raised eyebrows, no gasps. Just focus, respect. "This," Nia said finally, tapping the screen, "is clean. You documented while it was happening. Most people come to me after the house has already burned down." "I didn't want to be emotional," Amani said softly. "I wanted to be accurate." Nia looked up then, really looked at her. "That instinct is going to save you." The second call was harder. Gabe Lynn had once worked with Ethan, briefly, years ago, before leaving to build a career in forensic accounting. He was meticulous to the point of obsession, allergic to drama, and famously uninterested in sides, which was exactly why Amani trusted him. They met in his office, papers stacked in precise, almost aggressive order. Gabe listened, asked pointed questions, then began running numbers in silence that stretched uncomfortably long. "Do you know what's dangerous about this?" he said eventually. "That it's illegal?" Amani guessed. "That it's boring," Gabe replied. He didn't get sloppy because he was desperate. He got sloppy because he was comfortable. He pulled up a spreadsheet, highlighting transactions. Joint accounts used for personal expenses tied to professional misrepresentation. That's not just unethical. That's traceable. Amani felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief, alignment. Still, there was one more person she hesitated to tell. Her best friend, Lena, had known her since before Ethan, before the company, before the ambition calcified into responsibility. Lena knew the woman who laughed too loudly, who danced while cooking, who sometimes worried she was too much and never enough at the same time. Amani dreaded the pity. Instead, Lena listened, jaw tightening with every sentence. When Amani finished, Lena said only, "So what's the plan?" Amani blinked. "You're not going to tell me to slow down? To think about forgiveness?" Lena leaned forward. "I'm going to tell you to be careful, and then I'm going to help you." It was in that moment, sitting between a lawyer who saw patterns, an accountant who saw numbers, and a friend who saw her, that Amani understood what she'd been missing. Allies were not people who stood behind you and clapped. They were people who stood beside you and told you the truth, even when it complicated the story. Together, they built the framework. Nia handled strategy, divorce timing, IP claims, jurisdictional leverage. Gabe tracked money flows and liabilities. Lena became the anchor, reminding Amani to eat, to sleep, to remember she was more than a case file. But the most important decision came quietly. "You cannot do this alone," Nia said one evening, voice firm. "And you cannot let anyone turn this into a spectacle. If it becomes about revenge, You lose control of the narrative. Amani nodded. I don't want an audience. Good, Nia replied. You want witnesses. That distinction changed everything. They mapped risks, Ethan's board connections, his ability to spin, the unspoken biases that would surface the moment a black woman challenged a white male founder's mythology. If he senses what you're doing, Gabe warned, he'll preemptively discredit you. Amani thought of the way Ethan had begun framing her as overthinking, internal, protected. He already is, she said. Silence settled between them, not fearful, but focused. Then we move carefully, Nia said. We let him believe the version of you that benefits him. Amani felt the weight of that settle in her bones. She wasn't gathering sidekicks. She was assembling a coalition. People who wouldn't soften the truth to make it palatable. People who wouldn't center her pain over her power. People who understood that what she was doing wasn't about winning. It was about reclaiming authorship over her own life. As the miners walked home that night, the city felt different. Not hostile, not comforting, legible. She wasn't alone anymore, not in the way that mattered. And for the first time since the night of inventory, she allowed herself to think something that felt both dangerous and liberating. This is no longer a survival story. This is a reckoning. The shift was subtle enough that at first, Amani wondered if she was imagining it. That was the brilliance of it. Doubt, when deployed skillfully, never announces itself as an attack. It arrives as concern, as professionalism, as whispers phrased like advice. It began with a calendar change. A meeting she'd been scheduled to co-lead quietly moved to optional. An invite labeled strategic alignment disappeared from her inbox altogether. When she asked Ethan about it later, he didn't look up from his phone. Oh, he said casually, I didn't think you'd want to sit through that one. It was pretty high level. High level, Amani nodded, forcing herself to mirror the ease in his tone. Inside, something coiled tight. She had built the very strategy they were aligning around. But that wasn't the point anymore. The point was perception. A few days later, a junior analyst hesitated before speaking to her, eyes flicking toward Ethan's office first. Another colleague asked, too carefully, if she was doing okay, as if checking on someone recovering from an illness. That was when she realized what he was doing. Ethan wasn't attacking her work. He was attacking her stability. It escalated during a call with Northlake's internal team. Amani joined on time, notes prepared, ready to clarify a methodological question she'd flagged earlier. Before she could speak, Ethan cut in smoothly. Amani's been deep in the weeds on this, he said lightly. We've been pacing her a bit, making sure she doesn't burn out. Burn out. The words settled into the call like smoke. No one challenged them. Why would they? Concern was socially unassailable. Care could not be argued with. Amani felt heat crawl up her spine. Not rage, something sharper. Recognition. This was the move. When a woman can't be dismissed as incompetent, she can be reframed as overwhelmed. When she can't be ignored, she can be pitied. When her authority can't be challenged, her emotional capacity can. After the call, Amani closed her laptop and sat perfectly still. Her pulse thundered in her ears. This was the moment she had feared most. Not exposure, delegitimization. She imagined the narrative taking shape in rooms she wasn't in. She's brilliant, but she's under a lot of pressure. She takes things personally. We're protecting her. She pressed her palms into her thighs, grounding herself. She had seen this before, seen it done to other women, other black women, whose confidence was recast as aggression, whose boundaries became difficult, whose clarity was reframed as instability. She stood and went to the bathroom, locking the door behind her. The mirror greeted her again, relentless and honest. For the first time since the night of inventory, panic surged. What if he wins the story? What if the truth doesn't matter? What if they believe him? Her breath came shallow. Her hands shook, not violently, but enough to betray her calm. This was the doubt attack's true target, not her career. Her certainty. Amani closed her eyes and let the fear crest instead of fighting it. She named it silently, the way Nia had taught her. This is fear of erasure. She exhaled slowly. Then she opened her eyes and straightened. Because here was the part Ethan didn't understand. Doubt had lived with Amani her entire life. She had learned to function inside it, to succeed despite it, to sharpen herself against it until it became a tool rather than a weapon. If anything, this tactic confirmed what she already knew. He was scared. That evening, she documented everything. She wrote down the exact language he'd used, the context, the timing. She saved the call recording, the calendar changes, the follow-up emails that framed concern as control. She forwarded copies to Nia and Gabe without commentary. Nia replied first, "This is good for us. He's establishing motive." Gabe followed, "He's laying groundwork for a credibility defense." Sloppy. The reassurance steadied her, but the emotional toll lingered. Later that night, alone in the condo, Amani felt the weight of it all settle into her chest. She sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself one small private moment of grief, not for Ethan, but for the version of herself who had once believed excellence would protect her. It wouldn't, but preparation would. The next morning, she did something unexpected. She pushed back. Not publicly, not emotionally, strategically. She sent a calm, professional email to the Northlake liaison, copying Ethan. Following up on yesterday's discussion, I've attached a brief clarification on the identity model assumptions to ensure alignment. Please let me know if you'd like me to walk the team through the logic directly. No accusation, no defensiveness, just competence, placed squarely where it belonged. Ethan responded within minutes. "Thanks, Amani. I'll handle it." She smiled faintly and saved the reply. The doubt attack had failed in one crucial way. It had revealed his endgame. And now that she could see the shape of his fear, she knew exactly how much time she had left, and exactly how far he was willing to go to protect a narrative that was already cracking. This wasn't the beginning of the end. It was the moment the mask slipped just enough for her to measure the man beneath it. And she measured him precisely. Deadlines have a way of clarifying morality. Amani realized that the morning the Northlake contract became more than an opportunity, it became a countdown. The email arrived at 7:12 a.m., crisp and congratulatory. Final presentation scheduled, board in attendance, full executive review. The subject line alone carried weight. This wasn't just another client. This was the contract that would define the company's future, the one Ethan had been chasing with evangelical intensity. Amani read the message twice, then once more without blinking. This was the stage. Not because it was public, but because it was irreversible. She forwarded the email to Nia and Gabe with a single line. "This is it." The reply came quickly. "Timing matters more than force. If he signs before exposure, leverage drops. We move before ink." The plan they had sketched in fragments now snapped into focus, assembling itself with terrifying elegance. Every piece Amani had gathered, the proof, the patterns, the positioning, pointed toward this moment. The temptation to act immediately pulsed through her, sharp and urgent. She resisted it. Rushing was what Ethan did when he felt pressure. She would not mirror him. Instead, she prepared. She reviewed the Northlake materials one final time, not to improve them, there was nothing left to refine, but to remind herself of the truth. Every insight, every projection, every strategic leap that made the pitch extraordinary had come from her mind. The confidence she felt wasn't bravado, it was ownership. That afternoon, Ethan swept through the condo like a man buoyed by destiny. "This is it," he said, dropping his bag and grinning. "If this lands, we're untouchable." Amani watched him, studying the way certainty sat on his shoulders like a tailored jacket. "It's a big moment," she agreed. He poured himself a drink, already celebrating. "I've refined the narrative, streamlined it, cut out the noise." She knew what that meant. He had cut her out again. "Do you want me to walk through the data assumptions with them?" she asked lightly. "Just to preempt questions." Ethan waved a hand. "No need. I've got it covered. You know how boards are. They want confidence, not complexity. Confidence. She nodded, committing the sentence to memory. Another brick in the wall he was building around himself. That night, while Ethan slept beside her, Amani lay awake counting hours. Not anxiously, deliberately. Each hour was a resource. Each day narrowed the window. She thought about the cost of acting too soon, accusations of sabotage, emotional motives questioned, the narrative hijacked. She thought about the cost of waiting too long, signatures inked, power consolidated, truth reduced to inconvenience. There was a narrow path between them, and she had mapped it. 2 days before the presentation, she met Nia in her office. The documents spread across the table were immaculate, clean, factual, devastating in their restraint. "We served papers the morning of," Nia said. "Not before, not after." Amani absorbed the weight of it. At the office? Yes, where the myth lives. Gabe joined them on video, spreadsheets flickering behind him. "Financial disclosures ready. If he tries to move money, we flag it immediately." Amani listened, nodded, asked precise questions. But inside, another battle unfolded. This was the point of no return. She would be detonating the life she had once chosen, the marriage she had defended, the future she had helped build, brick by stolen brick. A part of her whispered, "You could still walk away quietly. Start fresh. Leave the story untold. Let him keep the illusion." The thought lasted all of 3 seconds. Because walking away wouldn't be peace. It would be permission. That evening, Ethan practiced his presentation aloud in the living room, pacing with easy authority. Amani sat on the couch, notebook in hand, the picture of support. He reached the climax, the slide that always drew admiration. Her slide. "This," he said, voice steady and proud, "is where we separate ourselves from every competitor." Amani looked up at him, really looked at him, and felt something unexpected. Not hatred, distance. The kind that comes when you finally see someone exactly as they are, stripped of mythology. When he finished, he turned to her, smiling. "What do you think?" She met his eyes. "I think it's going to make an impact." And she meant it, because impact didn't belong to him anymore. Later, alone in the bathroom, Amani stared at herself once more, not with doubt, not with fear, but with resolve. The countdown had begun, and for the first time, the ticking didn't feel like pressure. It felt like alignment. The contract was no longer about money or prestige. It was a timer. And when it reached 0, the story Ethan had been telling about genius, leadership, ownership, would be interrupted by something far more powerful: the truth. And truth, unlike confidence, didn't need rehearsal. The boardroom was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Toronto skyline like a declaration of power. Polished stone table, leather chairs, 12 executives seated with the relaxed authority of people accustomed to deciding the future of other people's work. At precisely 9 a.m., Ethan Caldwell stood. He looked exactly as he should: navy suit, open posture, voice calibrated for confidence. This was his natural habitat. A room that rewarded certainty more than truth. Amani sat to the side, hands folded neatly in her lap, posture composed. To anyone watching, she looked like support, like background, like she always had. The presentation began. Ethan spoke about vision, about market identity, about transformation. His words were fluid, persuasive, familiar in a way that made Amani's stomach tighten, not from fear, but from recognition. She had written this, not metaphorically, literally. Each insight traced a line back to a moment in her life: a sleepless night, a breakthrough scribbled on a napkin, a model refined until it could predict human behavior with unnerving accuracy. He delivered it flawlessly, the way someone does when they know the material, but not the cost of creating it. Heads nodded, pens moved. Approval settled into the room like a verdict forming. A senior executive leaned forward. "This framework is exceptional," she said. "It doesn't just sell a product, it sells identity." Ethan smiled, practiced and grateful. "That's exactly the goal." "No," Amani thought calmly. That was never your goal. Then it happened. The doors opened, not dramatically, not loudly, just enough to disrupt the rhythm. 3 people entered. A court officer, a woman in a dark blazer carrying a slim folder, and Nia Park. The silence that followed was absolute. Ethan turned, irritation flickering across his face. We're in the middle of... Mr. Caldwell, the court officer said evenly, you are being served. The word landed like a blade. Confusion flashed across Ethan's expression, followed by a reflexive laugh. This is a mistake. It's not, Nia said calmly. Amani stood. The movement drew every eye in the room. She walked forward, not quickly, not slowly, but with the measured confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going. She stopped beside Ethan, close enough to feel the heat of his panic radiating outward. There's no mistake, she said. Her voice carried, clear, controlled, unapologetic. She turned to the board. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption, she continued, but it's important you understand what you've just witnessed. She gestured to the screen behind Ethan. Every concept presented today, the identity model, the behavioral architecture, the predictive framework, was created by me. I am the original author. I have comprehensive documentation proving it. A murmur rippled through the room. Ethan shook his head, words tumbling out too fast. This is insane. We're partners. This is collaborative work. Amani looked at him then, not with anger, not with triumph, with finality. Collaboration requires consent, she said quietly, and credit. She turned back to the board and opened her folder. Inside were time-stamped files, version histories, and documented correspondence. She handed copies down the table with the practiced efficiency of someone who had prepared for disbelief. I've also filed legal claims regarding intellectual property misappropriation and financial misconduct, she added. Those proceedings are underway as of this morning. The woman who had praised the framework earlier studied the documents, her expression sharpening. You're saying Mr. Caldwell presented your work as his own? Yes, Amani replied, systematically, over several years. Ethan's face drained of color. Amani, he whispered, desperate now. Please, not here. She didn't look at him. This room, she said calmly, is where the narrative was built. It's where it needs to be corrected. The air felt charged, less like scandal, more like exposure. Not a spectacle, a reckoning. One of the executives leaned back, eyes fixed on Amani. If what you're saying is accurate, then the value proposition we're evaluating belongs to you. Amani nodded. That is correct. And would you be open, the executive continued slowly, to discussing a direct engagement? Ethan made a sound, half protest, half disbelief. Amani met the executive's gaze. I would. The room shifted, not toward chaos, toward clarity. Ethan stood frozen as the world he had constructed, slide by slide, meeting by meeting, collapsed under the weight of facts he could not talk his way around. The court officer stepped forward again. Mr. Caldwell will need you to come with us. For the first time, Ethan looked at Amani as if seeing her clearly. Not as an extension, not as a resource, not as a shadow, but as the author. As he was escorted out, the screen behind him still displayed her work. Her name now reflected faintly in the glass. Amani stood alone at the table. The boardroom was silent again. Then someone spoke. Ms. Rhodes, the executive said carefully, I think we should continue this conversation. Amani nodded once. The cut had been clean, and nothing that followed would ever be the same. The boardroom emptied slowly, as if no one quite trusted their legs to carry them away from what had just happened. Amani remained seated long after the last executive left, her hands resting flat on the table where moments earlier her life had split cleanly in two. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was fading now, leaving behind something heavier, quieter, more intimate. Nia touched her shoulder lightly. You did exactly what you needed to do. Amani nodded, But the affirmation slid past her like rain on glass. Because truth, she was learning, didn't arrive as relief. It arrived as aftermath. When she finally stood, the hallway outside the boardroom felt too narrow, the air too thin. She walked until she found a stairwell and closed the door behind her, the metallic click echoing like punctuation. Only then did she let herself breathe. Her chest tightened without warning, the sound catching halfway out of her throat. She pressed a hand against the cool concrete wall, grounding herself in the sensation, letting the tremor pass through her instead of resisting it. This was the price. Not guilt, she had none of that. Loss. She had detonated the future she once imagined with surgical precision. And even though it had been built on lies, it had still been hers. The memory of it flickered now, uninvited. Late nights laughing over takeout, shared dreams scribbled on scraps of paper, the naive conviction that love could be proof against power. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the stairs, head bowed. There would be no going back. The world would not forget what she had done, or how she had done it. Her phone buzzed. A text from Ethan, sent before his phone had likely been confiscated. You didn't have to do this. You humiliated me. Amani stared at the message, feeling something twist. Not remorse, but recognition. Humiliation, she realized, was what truth felt like to people who had never been questioned. She didn't reply. Another buzz, this time from a colleague. Are you okay? That was intense. Then another. You were incredible. The words landed unevenly. Praise felt dangerous now. Applause had a way of flattening complexity, of turning a woman into a symbol instead of a person. Amani powered her phone off. She needed silence. Later, alone in a taxi weaving through downtown traffic, the city blurred past like a memory she was no longer obligated to carry. The driver didn't recognize her, didn't know what had happened, didn't care. The anonymity was a gift. She rested her forehead against the glass and closed her eyes. Doubt tried once more to find its way in. What if you've made yourself unemployable? What if no one wants the woman who broke the myth? What if you're remembered only for the destruction, not the creation? Her stomach tightened. This was the part no one glamorized. The hours after courage, when certainty receded and consequences began to whisper. Back at the condo, Amani moved through rooms that still carried Ethan's imprint. His jacket draped over a chair, his mug in the sink. Evidence of a life that had ended without ceremony. She sank onto the couch and stared at the wall, exhaustion pressing down on her bones. It would have been easier, she thought, to disappear quietly, to walk away without correcting the record, to let him keep the illusion and start over somewhere else, anonymous and intact. But then she pictured the next woman, and the one after that, and the pattern repeating itself, polished and untouchable. Amani straightened. The truth had cost her comfort, but lies would have cost her herself. Her phone turned back on, lighting up with missed calls and notifications she wasn't ready to face. She ignored them and opened a blank document instead. She titled it, What Comes Next? Not plans, not revenge, just intention. She wrote one sentence, I will build something that cannot be taken from me. The simplicity of it steadied her. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the floor. Amani watched them stretch and fade, understanding now that truth was not a finish line. It was a threshold. Crossing it had demanded everything she thought she might lose. What remained, what she would have to build next, would require something else entirely. Faith, not in systems, not in people, in herself. And that, she knew with sudden clarity, was worth the price. Amani did not rebuild her life the way people expected her to. There were no victory interviews, no carefully styled photos announcing reinvention, no public statements dripping with triumph or vindication. She understood instinctively that spectacle would cheapen what she had fought to reclaim. This was not about flexing. It was about foundation. The first weeks after the boardroom cut were quiet in a way that felt almost unsettling. The legal machinery moved in the background, slow, deliberate, indifferent to emotion. Ethan's name began to vanish from places it once dominated, but Amani did not watch. She refused to measure her progress by his decline. Instead, she worked. She rented a modest office space on the east side of the city, brick walls, uneven floors, too much light in the afternoons. It wasn't impressive. It wasn't meant to be. She needed a place that belonged to her without explanation. She named it Rhodes Strategy Lab. Not after a promise, after authorship. The first hire took longer than expected. Amani interviewed carefully, asking questions no resume could answer. How do you respond when your ideas are challenged? What do you do when credit is unclear? Who taught you how to work? She wasn't looking for loyalty. She was looking for integrity. The team stayed small by design. No inflated titles, no mythology. Everyone knew exactly what they owned and why. Decisions were documented. Credit was explicit. Ideas were traced, not absorbed. At night, when the office emptied and the city settled into its hum, Amani often stayed behind alone, reviewing models with the same intensity she always had, but now without the dull ache of invisibility. This work felt different. Not easier, not lighter, cleaner. There were moments, quiet, unguarded ones, when fear crept back in. What if she had peaked in crisis? What if the world only wanted her when she was dismantling something, not building it? What if she had mistaken righteousness for sustainability? The doubts whispered loudest when money felt tight, when contracts took longer to close, when emails went unanswered. But then, something unexpected happened. Northlake reached out, not with fanfare, not with apology, with a question. Would you consider licensing the identity framework directly? Amani read the message twice, pulse steady. They weren't offering her Ethan's deal. They were offering her something more honest. Choice. She negotiated carefully. No rushing, no ego. She insisted on clarity, on ownership, scope, attribution. The agreement that followed wasn't explosive or glamorous. It was fair. And fair, she was learning, was revolutionary. Word traveled, not loudly, but precisely. Not, did you hear what she did? But, do you know how she works? Clients didn't come chasing spectacle. They came seeking rigor, transparency, results that didn't depend on borrowed confidence. One afternoon, as she watched her team debate an assumption with respectful intensity, Amani felt something settle in her chest that surprised her. Pride. Not the kind that demands witnesses. The kind that sustains you when no one is looking. She still received messages, articles dissecting the scandal, invitations to speak about betrayal and resilience. She declined most of them, not because she was ashamed, but because she refused to let pain become her brand. She would not be a case study in survival. She would be a standard. Late one evening, as rain streaked the windows, and the office hummed softly with the sound of machines cooling down, Amani sat back in her chair and allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She had not rebuilt faster than before. She had rebuilt truer. No one was standing in front of her anymore, filtering her ideas through their voice. No one was translating her brilliance into something more palatable. The work spoke directly now, and people listened. That was the quiet victory, not applause, agency. As she shut off the lights and stepped into the hallway, Amani realized something that felt both sobering and exhilarating. Rebuilding wasn't about proving she could do it alone. It was about proving she never should have had to. And this time, what she was building could not be taken from her, because it was designed, from the first brick, to recognize its own creator. This wasn't flexing. This was permanence. The first time Ethan called, Amani thought it was a wrong number. Her phone buzzed late on a Tuesday night, long after the office had emptied and the city had folded into quiet. An unfamiliar number flashed across the screen. She let it ring out, then returned to her laptop, eyes moving steadily across a grid of data that made more sense than people ever did. A voicemail appeared seconds later. She didn't listen right away. Not out of fear, out of discipline. She had learned that urgency was how manipulation got its foot in the door. When she finally pressed play, Ethan's voice filled the room like a ghost that still believed it had keys. Amani, it's me. A pause, the sound of him swallowing. I know you blocked my number. I just need 5 minutes. That's all. Please. Please. The word was so out of place on his tongue, it almost didn't sound real. Amani stared at the wall in front of her, not reacting, letting the silence stretch after the message ended. She felt something move inside her. Not sympathy, not triumph. Recognition. This was the season she had known would come. Begging rarely arrived at rock bottom. It arrived when the person falling realized the ground was real. 2 days later, another call, another number, another voicemail. This got out of hand, Ethan said, voice quieter. I didn't mean for it to become this. You know I love you. Love. Amani's mouth tightened. She had once lived inside that word like it was shelter. Now it sounded like a strategy. Then the emails began. Not to her work address, he didn't have it. To an old account he must have remembered from the early days. The subject lines were variations of the same insistence. We need to talk. Please read. I'm sorry, this isn't who I am. Each message followed a pattern as clean as any algorithm. First, remorse. Then, explanation. Then, reframing. I was under pressure. You know how investors are. I thought I was protecting us. I made mistakes. But we built it together. Together. The word again, trying to stitch itself back into her life. Amani read the messages once, then archived them. She didn't rage reply. She didn't argue. She refused to be pulled into the old dynamic where her energy became proof of his importance. But Ethan did not stop. He escalated the way he always had when he couldn't control a narrative. He sought a new storyteller. Her phone rang one afternoon as she was leaving her office, rain misting the sidewalk. The number was unfamiliar again, but the area code made her pause. Chicago, she answered, cautious. Hello? Amani, sweetheart. The voice was polished warmth wrapped around steel. It's Margaret, Ethan's mother. Amani's spine straightened. Margaret had always been charming in a way that made you question your own discomfort, smiling too brightly, complimenting too pointedly, offering kindness that felt like a test you didn't know you were taking. Amani, Margaret continued softly, I've been sick over all of this. Ethan he's not well. Amani said nothing. Silence was its own boundary. He's lost so much, Margaret pressed on. His company, his reputation, he's devastated. And I know you're hurt, but 2 wrongs don't make a right, darling. There it was, the moral high ground. The gentle suggestion that consequences were cruelty, that accountability was vengeance. Amani leaned against her car, watching pedestrians hurry past, umbrellas tilted against the drizzle. Her reflection stared back at her in the dark window, calm, composed, unmovable. Margaret, she said evenly, what is it you want from me? A small pause. Then the sigh, practiced, maternal. I want you to be merciful. You loved him once. Amani's throat tightened, not because the words struck her, but because they revealed something so clearly. Margaret wasn't calling to understand. She was calling to restore order, to put the world back where her son belonged, at the center of it. Amani exhaled slowly. I love someone I thought existed, she said. That person doesn't. Margaret's voice sharpened slightly. People make mistakes. This wasn't a mistake, Amani replied, still calm. It was a system, repeated, planned, funded, justified. Amani, I'm not finished. Amani's voice didn't rise, but something in it hardened into finality. He stole my work, redirected my credibility, and tried to undermine my stability when I began to resist. He didn't just betray our marriage, he used it. Silence. Then Margaret tried a softer angle, honeyed and desperate. He's been begging me to fix this. He says he'll do anything. He says he'll change. Amani felt a flicker of something, grief, distant and old. Not for Ethan, for the years she had spent believing change would come if she just loved harder, waited longer, proved more. She didn't allow the feeling to settle. Margaret, she said quietly, let me be clear. I will not meet him. I will not hear him out. I will not return to a life where my identity is negotiable. Her voice sharpened, not with anger, but with certainty. He wants forgiveness because he wants relief. I want freedom because I earned it. Margaret's breath hitched. You're really going to destroy him? Amani almost smiled at the phrase. I didn't destroy him, she replied. I stopped participating in my own erasure. She ended the call. Then she did something she hadn't done after the boardroom, or the filings, or the headlines. She blocked the number. Not dramatically, not as a statement, as closure. That night, back in her apartment, she listened to the city outside, cars passing, distant laughter, the ordinary world continuing. Her phone stayed quiet for nearly an hour. Then a final voicemail came in from yet another number. Ethan's voice sounded thinner now, stripped of performance. Amani, he whispered, please, I can't. His breath caught. I don't know who I am without you. Amani held the phone in her hand, still and silent, and for the first time, she understood the deepest truth of all. He wasn't begging because he loved her. He was begging because without her, he had to face what he truly was. Amani deleted the voicemail, not because she was cruel, because she was done. The begging season could last months, maybe longer. People like Ethan didn't release control easily. They kept trying different doors, different keys, different versions of the same story. But Amani had changed the locks. And this time, she wasn't going back. A year later, the city saw Amani Rhodes differently. Not as a headline, not as a scandal, not even as a survivor, but as a force. She stood on a small stage at a Toronto industry forum. No dramatic lighting, no swelling music, just a microphone, a quiet room, and people who had come not to watch a story unfold, but to learn from someone who had rewritten one. I used to believe credit was something you waited for, Amani said, her voice steady, unadorned. That if you worked hard enough, it would eventually find you. A pause, enough to let the truth settle. I don't believe that anymore. Credit isn't a gift. It's a record. And if you don't keep it, someone else will rewrite it. The room was silent in the way that meant people were listening, not admiring, not judging, absorbing. After the talk, there were no crowds pressing in, no cameras flashing, just a handful of thoughtful conversations. Serious questions, real interest, the kind that built careers instead of consuming them. That afternoon, Amani returned to her office, sunlight cutting across the floor, her name etched cleanly on the glass door. Inside, her team worked with focused ease, voices overlapping in debate and discovery. No one was performing. No one was shrinking. She sat at her desk and reviewed a partnership agreement she had negotiated herself. Not a buyout, not a concession, a collaboration that preserved what mattered most: autonomy. Her phone buzzed once. A notification, not a call. A major business publication had released its annual list of influential strategists under 40. Her name appeared near the top. No mention of scandal, no footnote about betrayal, just her work. Amani allowed herself a small smile, not because she'd won, but because she no longer needed to prove anything. She thought back to the woman she had been in that condo, staring at a receipt glowing on a screen, heart racing, future collapsing. That woman had believed invisibility was the price of love, that power was something borrowed, that peace meant silence. She knew better now. Power was authorship. Peace was alignment. Invisibility, true visibility, wasn't about being loud. It was about being undeniable. As dusk settled outside, Amani shut down her computer and stood by the window, watching the city pulse with possibility. Somewhere, people were still telling stories that erased others. Somewhere, brilliance was still being borrowed without permission. But not here. Not anymore. She had learned the lesson that changed everything. The best revenge against someone who tries to erase you is not to destroy them. It's to become so fully yourself that ignoring you is no longer an option. If this story moved you, if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or edited out, take a moment to like, comment, and follow. Share it with someone who needs the reminder that their work, their voice, and their identity matter. Because stories like this don't just end, they multiply.